Good morning, everyone. Praise be Jesus and Mary. I am Zarina Pipamugas, and I will be the one to report the four remaining topics for this learning module in Human Development Theoretical Perspectives and Hypotheses. These theoretical perspectives are as follows: the cultural framework approach by Lev Vygotsky, the behavioral approach by Skinner, the social learning approach by Albert Bandura, and the last one is the moral development approach by Lawrence Kohlberg. To start off, let's tackle about the cultural framework approach by Lev Vygotsky. This approach are who is Vygotsky and his background, the two main principles or elements of sociocultural theory, the two features of zone of proximal development, and the last one will be the four basic principles underlying the Vygotsky framework. Lev Vygotsky's background. Vygotsky was considered the Mozart of psychology. Lev Semenovich Vygotsky was born in Western Russia on November 5, 1986. His father Semilovich founded the Society of Education in Gomel and held a wide range of active interests, including foreign language, history, literature, theater, and arts. His mother was educated as teacher. In 1917, he graduated from Moscow University with a degree in law. Vygotsky completed 270 scientific articles, numerous lectures, and 10 books based on a wide range of Marxist-based psychological and teaching theories. He died on June 10, 1934, at the age of 37 after a long battle with tuberculosis. He was considered a seminal thinker in psychology, and much of his work is still discovered and explored today. Vygotsky's theory is that social interaction plays a very important role in cognitive development. It does not only focus on the individual child, but on the child as a product of social interaction, especially with adults. It also focuses on dynamic interactions rather than child by himself because people think differs dramatically between cultures because different cultures stress different things. The work of Lev Vygotsky has become the foundation of much research and theory in cognitive development over the past several decades, particularly of what has become known as social development theory. Vygotsky's theory stresses that the fundamental role of social interaction in the development of cognition, which is the conscious intellectual activity such as thinking, reasoning, or remembering, as he believed strongly that community plays a central role in the process of making meaning, quote unquote. The two main principles of this cultural approach by Lev Vygotsky is that the first one is the more knowledgeable other, also known as MKO. This refers to anyone who has better understanding or higher ability level than the learner. MKO is somewhat self-explanatory. It refers to someone who has a better understanding, again, or a higher ability level than the learner with respect to a particular task, process, or concept. Although the implication is that the MKO is a teacher or an older adult, this is not necessarily the case. Many times, a child's peers or an adult's children may be the individuals with more knowledge or experience. For example, who is more likely to know more about the newest teenage music groups, how to win at the most recent PlayStation game, or how to correctly perform the newest dance craze, a child or their parents? In fact, the MKO need not be a person at all. Some companies to support employees in their learning process are now using electronic performance support systems. Electronic tutors have also been used in educational settings to facilitate and guide students through the learning process. The key to MKOs is that they must have or be programmed with more knowledge about the topic being learned than the learner does. So this was also normally thought of as being a teacher, trainer, adult, or older. Again, MKO could also be peers, a younger person, or even computers. The next main principle of proximal development, or ZPD. Now, this is the difference between what child can accomplish alone and what he or she can accomplish with the guidance of others. The concept of more knowledgeable other is integrally related to the second important principle of this ZPD. This is an important concept that relates to the difference, again, between what a child can achieve independently and what a child can achieve with guidance and encouragement from a skilled partner. As you can see on the diagram below, the zone of proximal development, you can see the circle, how big the circle with letter A is. Now that is what I can learn on my own, or what a child can learn on his or her own. Now for the ZPD, you can see it is much bigger than the circle A. Now that is what I can learn with help, which is known as the zone of proximal development. And for the letter B circle, that is beyond my reach, or the stuff learners can't do even with support. For example, the child could not solve the jigsaw puzzle by itself and would have taken a long time to do so, if at all, but was able to solve it following interaction with the father and has developed competence at this skill that will be applied to future jigsaws. Vygotsky sees the zone of proximal development as the area where the most sensitive instruction or guidance should be given, allowing the child to develop skills they will then use on their own, developing higher mental functions. Vygotsky also views interaction with peers as an effective way of developing skills and strategies. He suggests that teachers use cooperative learning exercises where less competent children develop with help from more skillful peers within the zone of proximal development. Now, the two features of ZPD. The first one is the scaffolding. Now, I believe we have all seen a scaffolding in our lives. So we know what it can do, what it does, and how important it is for construction workers or in construction industry. Now, for Lev Vygotsky, this is the appropriate assistance given by the teacher to assist the learner accomplish a certain task or a given task. Now, this also requires that an instructor shows example how to solve a problem while controlling the learning environment so that students can take things step by step, expanding their knowledge without excessive frustration. Feature of ZPD is the reciprocal teaching. This provides an environment of open dialogue between student and teacher which goes beyond a simple question and answer session. You can see there in in your screen the reciprocal teaching. So those are the steps. First is to predict or the prediction. Second is the clarification. The third one is the question, and then the fourth one is the summary or yeah, the correlation to the proficiency level. The fourth objective is the four basic principles underlying the Vygotsky framework. First is that children construct their knowledge. Vygotsky believes that young children are curious and actively involved in their own learning and the discovery and development of new understandings or schema. However, Vygotsky placed more emphasis on social contributions to the process of development. According to Vygotsky, much important learning by the child occurs through social interaction with a skillful tutor. principle is that development cannot be separated from its social context. Vygotsky refers to this as a cooperative or collaborative dialogue, where the child seeks to understand the actions or instructions provided by the tutor, then internalizes the information using it to guide or regulate their own performance. The third principle is that learning is mediated. Vygotsky refers to tools of intellectual adaptation. These allow children to use the basic mental functions more effectively or adaptively, and these are culturally determined. Vygotsky therefore sees cognitive functions, even those carried out alone, as affected by the beliefs, values, and tools of intellectual adaptation of the culture in which a person develops and therefore socioculturally determined. The tools of intellectual adaptation therefore vary from culture to culture. And the last basic principle in this approach is that language plays a central role in mental development. Vygotsky differentiates between three forms of language. The first one is the social speech, which is external communication used to talk to others, typical from the age of 2. The second one is the private speech, typical from the age of 3, which is directed to the self and serves an intellectual function. And finally, private speech goes underground, diminishing in audibility as it takes on a self-regulating function and is transformed into silent inner speech. For Vygotsky, thought and language are initially separate systems from the beginning of life, merging at around 3 years of age. At this point, speech and thought become interdependent. Thought becomes verbal, speech becomes representational. When this happens, children's monologues internalize to become inner speech. The internalization of language is important as it drives cognitive development. Moving forward, two types of mental function. The first one is the lower mental function, which is those with which we are born. These are these wrong spelling on this. These are the natural functions and are genetically determined. Now, for the higher mental function, these are acquired and developed through social interaction. Conclusion in this approach is that sociocultural theory considers learning as a semiotic process where participation in socially mediated activity is essential. Moreover, social interaction emphasizes that learning happens through participation in social activities, making the social context of learning crucial. Now, for the sixth approach, behavioral approach by B.F. Skinner, or also known as Burroughs Frederick Skinner. He was born. Objectives of this approach are again, who is B.F. Skinner and his background, his famous Skinner box, which is the experiment with rats and pigeons. Then, um, in that experiment, we will talk about the consequences, reinforcement, punishment, and shaping. Then the third one, or the third objective, is the extinction and generalization. Then my conclusion. Boris Frederick Skinner's background. He was born on March 20, 1904, and died on August 18, 1990 because of leukemia. He was from a small Pennsylvania town of Susquehanna. His father was a lawyer and his mother was a housewife. He received his BA in English from Hamilton College in upstate New York. Skinner started his career as an English major, writing poems, and short stories. After this, Skinner attended Harvard, where he got his master's in psychology on 1930 and his doctorate on 1931 and stayed there to do his research until 1936. Studied in the field of psychology, especially on behaviors. Skinner married Yvonne Blue in 1936 and they had their first child, Julie, in 1938. In 1944, during World War II, Skinner worked on the Project Pigeon, which trained pigeons to direct bombs by pecking at a target. In 1943, when Yvonne was pregnant for the second time, Skinner designed the baby tender, a crib that was designed to be safer than a normal crib. You can see in your screen the famous baby tender of Mr. Boris Frederick Skinner. Operant conditioning is a method of learning that occurs through rewards and punishments for behavior. Through operant conditioning, an individual makes an association between a particular behavior and a consequence. Skinner is regarded as the father of operant conditioning, but his work was based on Thorndike's law of effect. According to this principle, behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences is likely to be repeated, and behavior followed by unpleasant consequences is likely to be repeated. Skinner introduced a new term into the law of effect: reinforcement. Behavior which is reinforced tends to be repeated. Example: strengthened. Behavior which is not reinforced tends to die out or be extinguished. Example for this is weakened. Skinner studied operant conditioning by conducting experiments using animals like the rats or and the pigeons. Skinner identified three of responses or operant that can follow behavior, which are the neutral operants, reinforcers, and the punishers. You can see in your screen the Skinner box, the famous Skinner box for which were experimented with rats. So there, rats were placed in metal cages with a number of levers. At first, the rats would nose around the cage and accidentally presses the levers, an action that would cause food or water to drop into a dish. After repeating the action, the rats saw that they could receive food and water by pressing the lever. So this is a learned behavior. So when the rats were rewarded, they were conditioned to repeat this positive action to continue being rewarded. Now you can see in your screen the famous Skinner box, which were experimented with rats. So rats were placed in metal cages with a number of levers. At first, the rats would nose around the cage and accidentally presses the levers, an action that would cause food or water to drop into a dish. So after repeating the action, the rats saw that they could receive food and water by pressing the lever. Now this is a learned behavior. Now, so when the rats were rewarded, they were conditioned to repeat this positive action to continue being rewarded. And this is the famous Skinner box, which were experimented for pigeons. So during World War II on 1944, there were no missile guidance systems, so Skinner decided to try and discover one. Skinner got funding for a top secret project to train pigeons to guide bombs, and he trained pigeons to keep pecking a target that would hold a missile onto a target. The pigeons pecked reliably, even when falling rapidly and working with warlike noise all around them. Again, this is a learned behavior, same with the rats. Then Skinner trained the pigeons to pick at a particular colored disc. Now, in your screen, you can see all the descriptions there. You can read it yourself, and I pity these pigeons because I know there were a lot of pigeons were used during this experiment. Now, talking about consequences, we can all think of examples of how our own behavior has been affected by reinforcers and punishers. Because as a child, you probably tried out a number of of behaviors and learn from their consequences. For example, if when you were young you tried smoking at school and the chief consequence was that you get in with the crowd you always wanted to hang out with, you would have been positively reinforced, example rewarded, and would be likely to repeat the behavior. If, however, the main consequence was that you were caught, caned, suspended from school, and your parents became involved, you would most certainly have been punished and you would consequently be much less likely to smoke now. So, in consequences, there will be reinforcement and punishment. The reinforcement is the process in which a behavior is strengthened and thus more likely to happen again. In punishment, this is the process in which behavior is weakened and thus less likely to happen again. Now, we also have these consequences. Now you can see there the positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, negative punishment. So what will happen in positive reinforcement? So in positive reinforcement, a rat presses a lever and receives food. So for the positive punishment, example, if the rat previously pressed the lever and received food and now receives a shock, the rat will learn not to press the lever. Now for the negative reinforcement, this is when a rat presses a lever and turns off the electric shock. And then for the negative punishment, if rat receives food consistently without pressing the lever, the rat will learn to stop pressing the lever. So those are for the consequences. In reinforcement, we have this so-called positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. For positive reinforcement, Skinner showed how positive reinforcement worked by placing a hungry rat in his Skinner box. The box contained a lever on the side, and as the rat moved about the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. Immediately it did so, a food pellet would drop into a container next to the lever. The rats quickly learned to go straight to the lever after a few times of being put in the box. The consequence of receiving food if they pressed the lever ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. So positive reinforcement strengthens a behavior by providing consequence an individual finds rewarding. For example, if your teacher gives you 5 pesos each time you complete your homework, so that's the reward, then you will be more likely to repeat this behavior in the future, thus strengthening the behavior of completing your homework. Now, for the negative reinforcement, this is the removal of an unpleasant reinforcer, which can also strengthen your behavior. This is known as negative reinforcement because it is the removal of an adverse stimulus which is rewarding to the animal or person. Negative reinforcement strengthens behavior because it stops or removes an unpleasant experience. For example, if you do not complete your homework, you give your teacher $5 or 5 pesos. You will complete your homework to avoid paying 5 pesos, thus strengthening the behavior of completing your homework. Skinner showed how negative reinforcement worked by placing a rat in his Skinner box and then subjecting it to an unpleasant electric current which caused it some discomfort. As the rat moved about the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. Immediately it did so, the electric current would be switched off. The rats quickly learned to go straight to the lever after a few times of being put in the box. The consequence of escaping the electric current ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. In fact, Skinner even taught the rats to avoid the electric current by turning on a light just before the electric current came on. The rats soon learned to press the lever when the light came on because they knew that this would stop the electric current being switched on. Punishment, we all know this weakens our behavior or the behavior of a certain person because punishment is defined as the opposite of reinforcement since it is designed to weaken or eliminate a response rather than increase it. It is an aversive event that decreases the behavior that it follows. Like reinforcement, punishment can work either by directly applying an unpleasant stimulus, like a shock after a response, or by removing a potentially rewarding stimulus, for instance, deducting someone's pocket money to punish undesirable behavior. Now, there are many problems with using punishment, such as punished behavior is not forgotten, it's suppressed. So, behavior returns when punishment is no longer present, Co- uh, as well as this causes increased aggression, shows that aggression is a way to cope with problems. Then this creates fear that can generalize to undesirable behaviors like fear of school or fear of someone. Then moreover, this does not necessarily guide toward desired behavior, or reinforcement tells you what to do. Punishment only tells you what not to do. A further important contribution made by Skinner is the notion of behavior shaping through successive approximation. Skinner argues that the principles of operant conditioning can be used to produce extremely complex behavior if rewards and punishments are delivered in such a way as to move an organism closer and closer to the desired behavior each time. To do this, the conditions or contingencies required to receive the reward should shift each time the organism moves a step closer to the desired behavior. In shaping, well, the technique of reinforcement used to teach new behaviors is at the beginning, people or animals are reinforcement for easy tasks and then increasingly need to perform more difficult tasks in order to receive reinforcement. So originally, the rat is given a food. Now, okay, let's go back to the rat. So the rat is given a food pellet for one lever press, but we gradually increase the number of times it needs to press to receive food. So the rat will increase the number of presses. And in extinction, we all believe that this is the elimination of the behavior by stopping reinforcement of the behavior. Example, for the rat who received a food when pressing a bar receives food no longer. The rat will gradually decrease the amount of lever presses until the rat eventually stops lever pressing. So that is the extinction or the elimination of the behavior. And then we have the generalization, which will the behavior may be performed in more than one situation. Now, for example, again for the rat in Skinner box. So a rat who receives food by pressing one lever may press a second lever in the cage in hopes that it will receive food. It is the tendency for a stimulus that is similar to the original conditioned stimulus to elicit a response that is similar to the new stimulus. Now, for my conclusion to this approach is that this theory of operant conditioning helps us to control the way humans learn behavior and how society can be a great influence on our behavior. This helps us to understand how to improve behaviors. Example for people with problems or for the people who are criminals. I'm not judging, but yes, this helps us understand them. Now, knowing how people learn behavior is a necessity to our society so that we can control and promote the good behavior which will benefit the society as a whole. The social learning approach by Albert Bandura. Isn't he a cutie on his picture? Okay, so moving on. The objectives in this approach are as follows. Again, who is Bandura and his background? The next is what is social learning approach? Then the third one will be types of observational learning effects. And then the fourth one will be the elements of observational learning, where we will tackle the three forms of reinforcement and the famous Bobodel experiment. Albert Bandura's background. He was born on December 4, 1925. He studied at University of British Columbia and University of Iowa. He was elected as president of American Psychological Association in 1974 and he was famous for his research on social learning theory. So to answer the question what in this approach is that social learning is called as an observational learning, and this emphasizes learning through observation of others because we learn not only how to perform a behavior but also what will happen to us in a specific situation if we do not perform it. The four types of observational learning effects are inhibition, disinhibition, facilitation, and observational learning. In inhibition, this is to learn not to do something that we already know how to do because a model being observed refrains from behaving in that way or does something different from what is intended to be done. In contrast, in this inhibition, is this is to learn to exhibit a behavior that is usually disapproved of by most people because a model does the same without being punished. For facilitation, this is to be prompted to do something that is not ordinarily done because of insufficient motivation. And lastly, for the observational learning, this is to learn a new behavior pattern by watching and imitating the performance of someone else. Now, moving forward to the elements of observational learning, we have the attention, which is the mental focus or the concentration. And then this is the willingness of the child to observe and mimic the behavior of a model. And then we have the retention. This is to encode the behavior in our memory and the ability of a person to store information or the learner or the child. And the third one is the production, which is to actually perform the behavior observed. No? So that is the production. And last is the motivation or reinforcement. Again, we hear the word reinforcement. This is the force that drives one or the learner or the doer to act. No? Motivation or reinforcement. So those are the elements of observational learning. And then we have the three forms of reinforcement. Reinforcement. We have the direct reinforcement. This occurs when an individual watches a model perform, imitates that behavior, and is reinforced or punished by some individual. That is the direct reinforcement. Second is that we have this vicarious reinforcement. This is when the observer anticipates receiving a reward for behaving in a given way because someone else has been so rewarded. And the last one is the self-reinforcement. This is when the individual strives to meet personal standards and does not depend on or care about the reaction of others. That and those are the three forms of reinforcements. The famous Bobodal experiment of Bandura. So during 1961 and 1963, he studied children's behavior after they watched a human adult model act aggressively towards a Bobodal. This is a doll-like toy with rounded bottom and low center of mass that rocks back to an upright position after it has been knocked down. So you can see it in your screen. Now, there are different variations of the experiment. The most notable experiment measured the children's behavior after seeing the human model get rewarded, get punished, or experience no consequence for physically abusing the Bobo doll. The experiments are empirical methods the to test Bandura's social learning theory because this claims that people learn largely by observing, imitating, and modeling. In this experiment, this demonstrates that people learn not only by being rewarded or punished, which is an operant conditioning, but they can also learn from watching somebody else being rewarded or punished, which is an observational learning. Now, these experiments are important because they resulted in many more studies concerning the effects of observational learning. Now, the new data from the studies has practical implications, for example, by providing evidence of how children can be influenced by watching violent media. The last approach for this learning module is the moral development approach by Lawrence Kohlberg. Tips in this approach are who is Lawrence Kohlberg and his background, again, and what is moral development, Kohlberg's theory of moral development and his famous Heinz dilemma, then the three levels of moral development and the four qualities of moral development. Lawrence Kohlberg. He was born on October 25, 1927 and died on January 17, 1987. He is an American psychologist and educator known for his theory of moral development. A psychologist who portrayed on education, anthropology, and philosophy to inform his work on the development of moral judgment and on moral behavior. Now, what is moral development? According to Kohlberg, this is an aspect of a person's overall development that follows over the course of a lifetime. Then, this is also the growth, and like all growth, it takes place according to a predetermined sequence. So, how did Kohlberg come up with the theory of moral development? All his ideas started from the research he performed with very young children as his subjects. He found out that children are faced with different moral issues and their judgments on whether they are to act positively or negatively over each dilemma are heavily influenced by several factors. In each scenario that Kohlberg related to the children, he was not really asking whether or not the person in the situation is morally right or wrong, but he wanted to find out the reasons why these children think that the character is morally right or not. Kohlberg's theory of moral development. So, this theory is a stage theory. In other words, everyone goes through the stages sequentially without skipping any stage, and assessed moral reasoning by posing hypothetical moral dilemmas and examining the reasoning behind people's answers. So he proposed three distinct of moral reasoning: the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. One of the best known of Kohlberg's stories concerns a man called Heinz who lived somewhere in Europe. Now, this is the story. Heinz's wife was dying from a particular type of cancer. Doctors said a new drug might save her. The drug had been discovered by a local chemist, and Heinz tried desperately to buy some. But the chemist was charging 10 times the money it cost to make the drug, and this was much more than the Heinz could afford. Heinz could not only raise half the money, even after help from family and friends. He explained to the chemist that his wife was dying and asked if he could have the drug cheaper or pay the rest of the money later. The chemist refused, saying that he had discovered the drug and was going to make money from it. The husband was desperate to save his wife, so later that night he broke into the chemist and stole the drug. Now the question. This I got these questions from the internet, which are the exact. I don't know if these are the exact questions, but it said here that Colbert asked a series of questions such as, should Heinz have stolen the drug? Now this is the dilemma. Would it change anything if Heinz did not love his wife? What if the person dying was a stranger? Would it make any difference? Should the police arrest the chemist for murder if the woman died? Because by studying the answers, according to Colbert, by studying the answers from children of different ages to this question, he hoped to discover how moral reasoning changed as people grew older. Now, the sample comprised 72 Chicago boys aged 10 to 16 years, 58 of whom were followed up at 3 yearly intervals for 20 years. This was according to Colbert 1984. Now, for you, if what will be your answer if I'll ask these questions from Lawrence Kohlberg? Should Heinz have stolen the drug? Would it change anything if Heinz did not love his wife? What would be your um what do we call this? What will be your answer, or what will be your I believe reason for this for these questions that Colbert has generated? Lawrence Colbert identified three distinct levels of moral reasoning, each with two substages. People can only pass through these levels in the order listed. Each new stage replaces the reasoning typical of the earlier stage, and not everyone achieve all the stages. So these three levels of moral development are the pre-conventional moral development. The second level would be conventional moral development, and the third level is the post-conventional moral development. At the pre-conventional level, where most 9-year-olds and younger, or some over 9, belong, they don't have a personal code of morality. Instead, their moral code is shaped by standards of adults and consequences of following or breaking their rules. So authority is outside the individual, and reasoning is based on the physical consequences of actions. And under this level, the, s- the two, the first and second stage or substages belong. So the first stage is the obedience and punishment orientation, where the child or individual is good in order to avoid being punished. Now, if a person is punished, they must have done something wrong. And this is related to Skinner's operational conditioning, where in this stage includes the use of punishment so that the person refrains from doing the action and continues to obey the rules. Now, for the second stage, where individualism and exchange or self interest or instrumental relativist orientation. So, during this stage, children recognize that there is not just one right view that is handed down by the authorities. Different individuals have different viewpoints, where a good action is seen as one that is in the best interest of the individual. Favors may be done for another child so that in return favors will be returned by the other. Lies could be told to cover for another so that in return a similar favor is owed to the individual. Then the underlying concern of stage thinking is what's in it for me. Now the child will follow rules if there is a known benefit to him or her, because children in this stage are very concerned with what is fair. Now, moving on to the second level of moral development is the conventional morality, where most adolescents and adults belong, and they begin to internalize the moral standards of valued adult role models. Then the authority is internalized but not questioned, and reasoning is based on the norms of the group to which the person belongs. Under this level is the stage 3 and stage 4, where good interpersonal relationships, or the so-called good boy, good girl orientation, where the child or individual is good in order to be as seen as being a good person by the others. Therefore, answers relate to the approval of others, because individuals at this stage of moral reasoning will try to win the approval of others so that their identity is perceived as good. The acceptance of the individual by the peer group has a huge impact in terms of what actions are considered good or bad. And at this stage, people tend to judge the morality of actions in terms of evaluating their consequences in relation to a person's relationships. Good and bad intentions are recognized. People want their relationships to be characterized by respect, gratitude, and treating others as we wish to be treated. A good action is therefore one that will bring about this positive result. And on stage 4 is the maintaining the social order, where the child or individual becomes aware of the wider rules of society, so judgments concerns obeying the rules in order to uphold the law and to avoid guilt. Because the desire to have a functioning society is at the heart of this stage of moral reasoning. Laws, norms, and conventions become very important insofar as they maintain a functioning society. People at this stage of moral reasoning have moved beyond the strong need for individual approval associated with stage 3. The concern at stage 4 is transcending individual needs in favor of the needs of society as a whole. The next is the last or the third level of moral development is so-called as post-conventional morality, where individual judgment is based on self-chosen principles and moral reasoning is based on individual rights and justice. According to Kohlberg, this level of moral reasoning is as far as most people get. Only 10 to 15% are capable of the kind of abstract thinking necessary for stage 5 or 6, which is post-conventional morality. That is to say, most people take their moral views from those who surround them, and only a minority think through ethical principles for themselves. Now, under this level is the stage 5 and stage 6, which is the social contract or the contract legalistic orientation and individual rights, where the child or individual becomes aware that while rules or laws might exist for the good of the greatest number, there are times when they will work against the interest of particular individuals. The issues are not always clear cut. For example, in Heinz dilemma, the protection of life is more important than breaking the law against stealing. Then, at this stage, it is recognized that individuals can hold different opinions and values, and this should be respected impartially. It is believed that contracts will allow the individual and society to both increase their welfare. It is therefore known as a contractual perspective. Freedom of choice becomes important, and certain fundamental principles are upheld, such as the right to life and the right to choose. At this stage, no single choice is seen as right or absolute, since others do not have the moral authority to judge the actions of the individual. And for the last stage is the universal principles or the universal ethical principle orientation, where people at this stage have developed their own set of moral guidelines which may or may not fit the law, where the principles apply to everyone. Example, human rights, justice, and equality, where the person will be prepared to act to defend these principles even if it means going against the rest of society in the process and having to pay the consequences of disapproval and or imprisonment. Now, Colbert doubted few people reached this stage because in this stage, moral reasoning is based on abstract reasoning. Conscience is seen as an important factor in making moral decisions. Mutual respect is valued as a universal principle. Laws are seen as valid only insofar as they promote the principle of justice. Therefore, there is an obligation on people to disobey an unjust law. Decisions are met categorically and in an absolute way rather than with conditions attached. Now, the four qualities of moral development. The stage 1 is the stage development is steady. One must progress through the stages in order, and one cannot get to a higher stage without passing through the stage immediately preceding it. The second qualities of moral development is that subjects cannot comprehend moral reasoning at a stage more than one stage beyond their own. Thus, a person at stage 2 who categorizes good and bad on the basis of his own pleasure cannot comprehend reasoning at stage 4, which appeals to fixed duties the performance of which need not offer any promise or reward or pleasure. The third quality of moral development is that subjects are cognitively attracted to reasoning one level above their own main level. This is where a stage 1 person will be attracted by stage 2 reasoning, then a stage 2 person by stage 3 reasoning, and so on. Kohlberg states that reasoning at a higher stages is cognitively more acceptable than reasoning at lower stages, since it resolves problems and dilemmas in a more satisfactory way. And the last quality of moral development of Kohlberg is that movement through the stages is effected when cognitive uncertainty is created. That is, when a person's cognitive outlook is not suitable to cope with a given moral dilemma. If in a given situation one's cognitive framework cannot resolve a problem, the cognitive organism adjusts to a framework which does. Yet, if a person's orientation is not disturbed, there is no reason to expect any development. Now, my conclusion for this approach is that Kohlberg believed that most moral development occurs through social interaction. These qualities of moral development are important to keep in mind. They have not only been verified by research, but they also make sense if one looks at the development of one's cognitive capacity as a kind of orderly growth. Thank you so much for listening and have a good day. Be safe, everyone.